Donc Mathieu a publié plusieurs études tout à fait remarquables sur la modélisation, la simulation du mouvement, en particulier chez les Australopithèques, chez la fameuse Lucie dont on a déjà abondamment parlé ce matin. Et donc je pense que c'est ce qu'il va nous présenter maintenant. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much for having me, and thanks everyone for being here. So, as was just said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that my collaborators and I have been doing on human, chimp, and some more recent stuff on Australopithecus, Afarensis walking capabilities. So, as other presenters have already mentioned, and I think many people are already aware, humans and chimpanzees share a common ancestor about 7 to 8 million years ago, or I'm going to say it's about 7 to 8 million years ago. And along the human lineage, we have a really, I think, a really impressive hominin fossil record. Of course, if you spend all of your time looking at fossils, you find all of the gaps in the fossil record, and there's lots of missing pieces and things that we don't know. But when we look at it kind of en masse, we can see that, you know, as we go deeper back in time, back from kind of the humans today all the way back to that 7 to 8 million year old chimp human common ancestor, we see an increasingly number of ape-like traits, and some of them are in the upper limb, but we also see them in the lower limb. If we look at something like Ardipithecus ramidus, we can see a pelvis that's kind of a hybrid of a chimp and a human pelvis, and a foot with a divergent big toe, and then upper to lower body limb proportions that look much more ape than human-like. Now, if we're interested in something like the evolution of locomotor performance, the way I kind of approach these questions is to start by looking at our two extant, or humans and chimpanzees, right? These two sister taxa that emerged from this 7 to 8 million year old divergence. And so, part of the question is, well, what are kind of the commonalities and differences that we see between human and chimpanzee bipedalism? Or just broadly in terms of their locomotor capabilities. And if you're interested in locomotor performances, I think we all are, the main locomotor behaviors that you're probably interested are going to be walking, running, and climbing. And so we know from a suite of studies, some of which I've done, some of which other presenters here have contributed to, we know that when we look at walking, when humans walk around, we have a very distinct mode of bipedal travel, but when chimps do it, they use a costly, flex limb, wide-hipped, wide step width bipedal walking posture. So, both in terms of visual representations, but also in terms of the underlying energy consumption, it seems to be quite distinct from what we do. So we see some interesting differences in terms of walking capabilities. Now, what about running? And of course, we've already heard quite a bit about the sort of the differences in the aerobic capacity of humans and other taxa, including chimpanzees. Now, chimpanzees, when you put them up on two limbs and have them move at a wide range of speeds, they can move into this sort of running speed range that we, are quite proficient at. But there are quite a few limitations in terms of what they can do in terms of running capabilities. One of which is they have a lot of trouble getting their bodies up into the air. They just can't get much of an aerial phase going. And so when they move around at high bipedal speeds, they use this sort of what we call like a grounded running bipedal stride. Additionally, I think as we all recognize, they're not particularly quick when you put them on two limbs. They're not going to outrun even the average human runner. And of course, their top speeds, even if we've not exactly measured what those are, we can be pretty confident that no bipedal chimpanzee is going to outrun any competitive sprinters. Now, it's not all bad news for chimpanzees because they're quite proficient climbers. When they hop on a vertical substrate, they're able to ascend it quite easily without much trouble at all. We can climb vertical substrates as well, but it typically involves quite a bit of mechanical assistance, as we can see in this individual up on the left, who's using ropes, and then he has some spikes on his feet, and this individual on the right that has kind of a rope wrapped around his feet to help him climb these vertical substrates. So what I want to focus in on, though, is on the bipedal walking capabilities of chimps and how that works compared to humans. And one of the things that I'll mention is that while, you know, chimpanzees, of course, are living relatives, their mode of bipedal walking doesn't seem to be completely distinct from other non-human primates when they walk around on two limbs. There's a number of morphological differences that between, say, chimps and a monkey, but we take something like a macaque and we have it walk around bipedally. It has a much different pelvis and lower back, but its kinematics, that is the way its lower limbs move, are basically the same as what we see in a chimp. If anything, they walk with a slightly more flexed limb posture. And so I think, you know, given the commonalities in chimps and other non-human primates in terms of their bipedal capabilities, we're on pretty firm theoretical ground to infer that what bipedalism looked like before we get the emergence of the hominid lineage is quite similar to something that we can observe in chimpanzees today. And so then the question is, well, if that's what bipedalism looked like 7 to 8 million years ago, what are the kind of distinct, detailed, quantitative differences that we can observe, and what might underlie those quantitative differences? So one of the things that we can look at is we can look at the forces that the feet apply to the ground when we walk bipedally and when chimpanzees do as well, and we see that, you know, when chimps walk on two legs, they generate this vertical monophasic ground reaction force. Our form of our vertical ground reaction force is quite distinct. We have this double humped pattern, and so that's one of the important distinctions here. And then there's some characteristics of our kinematics. When we walk, we land on our heels at the beginning of a stride. When bipedal chimpanzees do that, their ankle kinematics don't seem to match ours, and they aren't consistent heel strikers in the way that we are today. Of course, it's long been known both qualitatively and then quantitatively that there's quite a few differences in terms of hind limb extension in chimpanzees. They use more of a flex limb posture. We, of course, have these extended long walking strides. And then if we think about it more in 3D rather than just from the sagittal plane, there's some differences in hip abduction. We tend to have narrow step widths. Chimps have wide step widths and abducted hips. And then there are some kinematic differences in terms of how we move the pelvis when we walk around bipedally. When we move onto one limb, our pelvis dips down on the unsupported side, whereas in chimps and some other non-human primates, they tend to pitch their pelvis or list it over the support side. So it's kind of moving up. So the question is, kind of for this talk at least, is sort of where are we with regard to all of these kinematic differences at about 3.5 million years ago in Australopithecus afarensis? So my approach to the question is a bit different from the one we just heard about, and a lot of more comparative morphological approaches where we kind of try and extract some information from looking at skeletal structure, the details of the internal structure of the bone. In my case, what I want to do is I want to approach this problem from the standpoint of musculoskeletal modeling and simulation. And so this is an approach that kind of comes out of the human kinesiology world. And in this case, we're interested in measuring a bunch of details and predicting a lot of details that are difficult to measure directly. And so the first thing that we have to do if we want to take this approach is we want to build a detailed musculoskeletal model that we can compare to a human musculoskeletal model. And so my collaborators and I did this back in 2013. We published a detailed model of the chimp pelvis and hind limb, and that involved assembling the skeleton. So we scanned a chimpanzee skeleton of known body mass. We articulate all the bones. We put all the major muscles on the pelvis and hind limb that we know are supposed to be there, and then we parameterize those muscles by giving them a bunch of contractile properties and muscle dynamic behavior that allows the muscles to actually shorten and lengthen, generate force, do all that important stuff. So we published this model. You can download it from SimTK if you're so inclined. you want to model chimpanzee bipedalism, all the tools are there for you. We also have, and I mentioned this just because I'm going to show this later, we've also put an upper body on our chimpanzee model. A lot of the work that I'm going to do involves having a full body model, and so we have a upper body model as well, but I'm not going to get into any details about that. So we have all the details of the musculoskeletal structure of humans and chimpanzees, and when we want to generate a simulation of how humans walk or how any other taxa walk, we have to think about something that we don't, I think about very much in terms of paleoanthropology, and that's sort of the control of that musculoskeletal structure. And of course, if Monty Python has taught us anything at all, it's that we can move our musculoskeletal system in a lot of different ways. But we don't tend to do that when we want to just walk around this room or go out and get a coffee or whatever. We tend to use a fairly stereotyped, narrow range of limb motions and forces. And so one of the questions is just simply, what's the control criteria that we're trying to operate under in order to govern how we use our musculoskeletal system? Is it something like we want to minimize muscle fatigue or minimize muscle energy costs or minimize joint contact stress? There's a range of different questions that we can look at. But from a comparative evolutionary perspective, I think the kind of important question is, are there control criteria that predict human walking and chimpanzee bipedal walking simply based on their musculoskeletal structure? So for the first kind of part of the results here, what I want to do is I want to talk about some simulations that we've been generating with human and chimpanzee bipedalism. I'm going to focus on two kind of criteria that are thought to govern a lot of the way that we walk bipedally. So the first of these is a series of what I'll call sort of muscle fatigue-like criteria. So if you're a muscle physiologist out there, you're just going to have to bear with me and accept muscle activation to an exponent as a good proxy for fatigue. But the general idea here is that muscle fatigue, we can raise it to an exponent, and we can look at a bunch of exponents, and those different exponents just as we increase that, we're increasing the amount of force sharing across our muscles in the hind limb. So at lower exponents, we tend to rely on a few muscles, and then we generate simulations with really high exponents. We tend to rely on a broader range of muscles more equitably. And there's been theoretical arguments put forward as to what may be a better criteria for predicting human walking, but we'll look at that directly here. The second criteria that we want to look at is muscle energy costs. And I'm going to use a existing muscle energetics model, which I won't go into any details about here. I'll spare you that. But suffice it to say that this is a model for predicting how much energy a given muscle is using based on the dynamics of the muscle behavior, but also its activation level. And so we can either minimize muscle fatigue using at these different criteria or minimize muscle energy costs and kind of see how these parameters do in terms of predicting human and chimp walking. So I'm going to generate a bunch of simulations, and I want to compare it to some experimental data, and these are experimental data that I published over several years. And the main point here is just that we're looking at humans and chimps moving at the same dimensionless speed to try and make the comparisons as sort of physiologically comparable as we can. So the first thing I'll show you here are some tracking simulations of the vertical ground reaction force. Okay, so we have human ground reaction forces on the right, chimpanzee ground reaction forces on the left. The experimental data is in white, and then the tracking simulation data is in red. The only important thing to recognize here is that our human model can generate human-like ground reaction forces, and our chimp model can generate chimp-like ground reaction forces. So they're both capable of moving like the animals that we've modeled here. So now let's put on a bunch of predictive simulation results. So these results are based on minimizing our different muscle activation criteria without any regard to the experimental data at all. So these are just, say, given this musculoskeletal structure, if you want to walk in a manner that minimizes activation squared, activation cubed, these are what your ground reaction forces are going to look like. And what we see is that activation squared and activation cubed tend to give our best results. And we're going to assess that by calculating something called the root mean squared error, which is just this value at the bottom. And basically, the lower that number, the closer it is to the experimental data. So we get our best kind of predictions from those two criteria. What about when we use cost of transport as our predictive criteria? So cost of transport doesn't seem to work quite as well in terms of predicting the ground reaction force data in either taxa, although it's a commonly used criteria in human walking simulations. But it's particularly not good for bipedal chimpanzees, because a couple of things that it does is it starts to make the chimp generate ground reaction forces that look more human-like. It generates a vertical ground reaction force that has that two-phase hump to it, that biphasic vertical ground reaction force, and it gives us a much stronger kind of push-off force, which you can see in that sort of second row of results on the right. Okay, so what about tracking simulations for our kinematics? Again, our human and chimp models can walk like the animals that they represent. When we use activation cubed, squared, and so on, we get our best kinematic predictions from activation squared and cubed. And to compare that to cost of transport gives us better predictions of the 3D kinematics, although there is note that in the knee flexion angles, you can see that it gives us also a more extended knee in the chimpanzee model. Now, to just show you what the activations cubed results look like, because those are the ones I'm going to focus on, you can see that just sort of qualitatively, our human model's walking like a human and our chimp model's walking like a chimp, and that's based strictly on our model itself and the optimization criteria that we've chosen. It's not informed by the experimental data at all. So we think that this is probably a pretty good path forward if we want to use what we can call sort of a single objective criteria. We want to use one sort of physiological parameter to drive our walking simulations. So activation squared and cubed were our best results, but I'm going to focus a bit more on the activation cubed results. The cost of transport predictions are interesting, but the bottom line for me is that they seem to do a better job. They do a better job with the humans and the chimpanzees, and the ways in which the chimpanzees are off make the chimps walk a bit more human-like. So if we think about sort of control strategies as part of the human evolutionary story, if minimizing metabolic cost has been something that has been selected for over the course of hominin evolution, it might have actually involved changing or shifting or increasing our emphasis on metabolic costs in terms of hominin walking. So now that we've done that, let's go to the fossil record and see what we can do. So the first thing we need to do is we need to build a model of a fossil hominin. So here we have Australopithecus afarensis. And we can, of course, go through all the same steps we had to do in terms of building our chimpanzee musculoskeletal model, right? The first thing we need is a robust skeleton. We've already heard about this, one of the great French and American collaborations between Yves Coppin and Don Johansen. So we have this terrific skeleton that really is pretty comprehensive to allow us to reconstruct the pelvis and hind limb musculoskeletal structure. So that seems kind of like the less intimidating part. The more intimidating part is the musculature. Of course, we don't have a fossil record of the muscle system, and so how do we go about building out the musculature? Well, a couple of things to note. One is that humans and chimps have all the same muscles. So they're all the major muscles that humans have, chimpanzees have. There are a few minor differences of muscles that appear infrequently, but suffice it to say, we need to have all the same muscles in Australopithecus afarensis. Then the question is, well, what about the size of that musculature? So we can use a few different approaches, but one thing I would point out is if we take the best available MRI data from human muscle measurements, that is, where you've modeled the full volume of the hind limb muscles, and we compare it to the best available cadaveric measurements from chimpanzees, the most comprehensive data, much of which actually comes from pygmy chimpanzees, we can see that humans and chimps have about the same percentage of their body mass devoted to hind limb musculature. So about 10% of our body mass is hind limb musculature. About 10% of a chimpanzee's hind limb is muscle mass as well. And so that gives us a pretty good starting point. If we can estimate the body mass of our fossil taxon, we can come up with a pretty good approximation of what the lower limb muscle mass should be. Now, that isn't to say there's no differences among humans. If we look at sort of more high-performing athletes, we see a larger percentage of body mass in the hind limbs, about 13% in college athletes. I'm sure a little bit more in some of the Olympic athletes we'll be seeing here later. But unless you want to model your Afarensis as a college baseball player, I think 10% is probably a good place to start. So then the last issue is, well, now we have our muscles and we have our muscle sizes. What about the contractile properties? I've done a bit of work with some collaborators on looking at the details of muscle contractile properties, isometric muscle force, maximum shortening velocities, and other things in human and chimp muscles. And what we see is, at least at the level of individual fiber types, we have comparability across humans and chimps. So again, we can assume some commonalities here and are on pretty firm kind of experimental and theoretical ground. So then the question, the first question I wanted to ask with this is, well, can Afarensis walk like a human, and can Afarensis walk like a chimp? We, of course, can walk in a lot of different ways, and when we have our Afarensis model track human data and track chimpanzee data, we see generally a good correspondence overall. So Afarensis appears to be able to generate forces that look pretty similar to both species. And a generally similar story if we try to track the 3D kinematics. Now, not completely identical, and in fact, as you can see, if we look at these RMSE values down here on the right, we can see that the Afarensis model has an easier time tracking the human data than the bipedal chimpanzee data. So that's certainly leading, and I can just show you what Afarensis would look like if it walked identically to a human or identically to a chimp. And that's leading. That tells us what it could do, but it doesn't tell us exactly what it likely did. And so to do that, we need to move on to these sort of 3D predictive simulations. Okay, and so to use that, we're going to run these simulations using that criteria that worked well for humans and worked well for chimps. And you can see we get a lot of characteristics that are looking very human-like. We have a heel strike, for example, at the beginning of the stance phase. At mid-stance, or in that single support period, we see a bit more flexion at the knee, there's a bit more flexion at the hip, and then we have a strong push-off in that second double support period. So to just give you an animation of, you know, what a Afarensis, let's see, walking around at Hadar might have looked like. So we can see that qualitatively there's a lot of human-like walking here. But in the details, there are probably some differences, and that isn't entirely surprising to me. There are, of course, some important differences in the skeletal structure and likely some of the musculoskeletal structure. But I will admit that this is some sort of initial passes at some of this work, but I think we can say, you know, that using this approach, we get much more human than chimp-like bipedal walking in Afarensis. There are some differences that I don't have enough time to get into, but have to do with the 3D pelvis motion that are probably tied into some of the morphological differences we see between human and Afarensis pelvis. But of course, you know, this sort of work, it requires a lot of additional analyses and recalculations of variables, and so we need to really explore what this optimal control surface looks like for this parameter given this musculoskeletal structure. But I do think that generally speaking, this is a fairly objective way to go about reconstructing not just snippets of what a bipedal stride of these fossil hominins might have looked like, but actually what the full-blown gait was likely like. So we're continuing to work on this, and I will be sure to keep everyone updated on all of this. But thank you so much for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions.